So again, to sum up the first stage, we have a combination of two things: an authoritative understanding of what beauty is based on Greek standards of individual bodies, which are essentially white bodies being depicted in ancient Greece and Rome, combined with a natural history, a truth-based historical understanding of the development of different species, different a taxonomy of all living and non-living things based on observable categories, saying these characteristics belong to this creature and we can therefore put it in this category. These two things in combination produce the first stage of modern racism, according to Cornel West. In the second stage, we see a further development of these same themes. He talks about lots of different figures that are developing this, including this notion of these pseudosciences, phrenology and physiognomy, which are essentially made-up scientific fields or subfields that can describe and say something about individuals based on measurements of their head and their face. So what West is saying is that we essentially mapped on the natural history approach that is based on observable characteristics. We map that framework onto observations and categories of humans in order to produce modern concepts of race. So they didn't pre-exist. There was actually the work was done to produce a notion of a white race and a non-white race, etc. For Blumenbach, his argument is he's taking measurements of, for instance, the statues and sculptures in Greece and making claims about facial symmetry in relation to the climate, in relation to the superiority of individuals. All of it is made up, but it is taken as credible because it uses the scientific method to make these claims. Coincidentally, that Blumenbach and these Western European folks are saying Europe happens to have the very best climate to develop the very best facial structures, which reflects in this vast superiority of Europeans to non-Europeans. And we see this sort of second phase of modern racism develop. There's also a movement from this very scientific measurement-based idea to a more casual glance, or the normative gaze, saying, I can just look at someone and see how ideal their facial structure is, or how ideal their appearance is, and we can see how this translates so easily into forms of modern racism as we see it today. What are the theoretical consequences? Well, West says that even those folks who were very progressive, even in the 19th century, who were opposed to slavery, still came to understand the world in terms of white supremacy, still had white supremacy baked into the very concepts, ideas, literature, aesthetics, etc., that were found in society. White supremacy was found there because all these conceptions had sort of leaked into these different aspects of our life. So the conclusions that were drawn were based on racist assumptions, even if they weren't malicious or based on individual prejudices or things like that. So the transition became, rather than a distaste for non-white individuals, it was a sense of we must integrate non-white individuals into society in order to help them become more like white individuals. Let science and humanity find a remedy for the natural disparities found in nature. This would be for the benefit of all people. So we can see how this, of course, is based on racist and false claims, but it's not malicious in the same way that we sometimes think of racism. And I think West emphasizes this in order to remind us that racism is an institutional and cultural form of prejudice rather than an individual bias or some sort of bias that an individual might have about another person, right? That it's actually much more pervasive than that. He says we can look to people who appear not to be theorizing about race at all, right? The philosophers of the Enlightenment, and see do they hold within them forms of racism? Is there white supremacy embedded in the Enlightenment thinkers in Europe? And the answer is, of course, yes. So if you look at Voltaire, Hume, Kant, Montesquieu, Jefferson, Machiavelli, Plato, any of the thinkers, not Plato, but any of the thinkers that we've read, for instance, found within them are latent or sometimes explicit racist claims, even if their discussion is not based on race at all. And again, these are the thinkers that inform modern discourse today. When we talk about the Academy of Philosophy or political theory or or any of the hard sciences, for instance, they're all based on these philosophies built by folks who carry with them a legacy of racism. That the forms of discourse that we use, the philosophers that develop the philosophy that inform our forms of knowledge, all of those are derived from white supremacy, implicitly or explicitly. He concludes by asking whether the emergence of modern racism was inevitable or contingent. And I'll save most of this for the discussion in class, but I think it's a reasonable question to ask whether these forms of the confluence of these three historical developments, the scientific revolution, Cartesian philosophy, and the classical revival, had to yield modern racism. If modern racism was inevitable based on the emergence of those three things.